All right, by my watch, it is 7 p.m. So I'm going to get things started this evening. Thank you for attending the York Civil War Roundtable for February 15th, 2023. My name is Adam Bentz, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Library and Archives at the York County History Center. And we're very happy once again to be doing a Zoom and hosting the York Civil War Roundtable. Before we get on to some upcoming events and obviously the introduction of our speaker and our presentation this evening, I was asked by Kathy Friel, who is the program director of the Roundtable, to read a little bit of some announcements, some memorial announcements, and probably many of you out there are aware of the passing of these folks. Kathy has prepared the following for me to read. Unfortunately, both of these gentlemen were longtime members of the Roundtable and passed away toward the end of last year and just at the beginning of this year. Tonight's Civil War Roundtable is dedicated to the memory of two longstanding members, Richard Dick Simpson and William Bill Schroyer Jr., who recently passed away. Their presence will be greatly missed as they were both regular attendees of our monthly meetings. Dick Simpson of Lancaster was a regular presenter to the Roundtable for many years. His love of history led him to give lectures on the Civil War from Delaware to Maine to local societies, Civil War roundtables, retirement communities, and church groups. These lectures raised money for many different groups, including the Save the Franklin Battlefield, a charitable organization in Tennessee. He was an active member of dozens of Civil War organizations, including the General Meade Society and Pamplin Historical Park. Dick is survived by his loving wife, Deborah. Bill Schroyer of York and his daughter, Lisa, probably attended almost every Roundtable meeting together since 2007, when the Roundtable formed its partnership with the History Center. Lisa was a reenactor with the 87th Pennsylvania, and they rarely missed a meeting. More dedicated members would be hard to find. They even convinced Mom Edith to start attending, which she did. The three of them seen together each month, a true family affair. Bill enjoyed reading and studying the Civil War, mainly the Battle of Gettysburg. He also enjoyed touring Civil War battlefields and going to reenactments. He was a member of the York Civil War Roundtable, the Gettysburg Foundation, and the York County History Center. Bill was also a member of the York City Retired Firefighters Association. He is survived by his wife, Edith, sons Larry and Kevin, and daughter Lisa. Our heartfelt condolences and deepest sympathies are extended to the families of Dick and Bill. We are truly sorry for your loss. We will miss you each month and know that you will be watching from heaven and resting in eternal peace. The following Gettysburg Black Powder program is for you. We will see you again on the other side. With deepest sympathy, Kathy Friel. So thank you for getting that to me, Kathy. And if family members are watching tonight, please know that the History Center is is with you with thoughts and prayers. We couldn't have the Roundtable, we couldn't have a History Center if not for the history buffs out there who show up, who join, who participate, and who appreciate what we do. So after that somber note, if you can bear with me, we have the obligatory upcoming events. As you know, the History Center is constantly doing something, often several events in the same week. So many of you are familiar with our popular All Vets program. Our next All Vets is a week from tonight at 7 p.m. at the Historical Society Museum. And All Vets will be welcoming Bill Armstrong, who will be discussing his great uncle, George Wood, the only African-American from York who was killed in action in World War I. On February 25th, that's Saturday, February 25th, between 9 and 1 p.m., the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be presenting a genealogical seminar for beginners at the History Center Museum. Learn the steps needed to delve into your family's history. Bring along your laptop or tablet and become acquainted with the resources that can be used in discovering more about yourself and your loved ones. We still have a handful of slots. That is proving to be a popular program. So if you're interested, please check it out on our website and get registered. That's 2 Saturdays from today. All right, and February 27th, that's Monday night at 7 p.m. Our popular bookmarked program is returning on Zoom. And this month, we will be discussing Erik Larson's The Splendid and the Vile. Last month, I mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. A great book about Winston Churchill, his family, his associates, and a few Americans thrown in for good measure, and what it was like surviving and handling and preparing and finally ultimately pushing back against the German Blitz in 1940 and 1941. So that discussion's on the 27th of February, 7 p.m. It's a free event. You can register on our website. And that is in preparation for the final event you'll see on this calendar. That's on April 18th, when the History Center proudly welcomes Erik Larson to York, who will be speaking at 8 p.m. at the Appel Center. This is a ticketed event, and it is a fundraiser for the History Center. He'll be interviewed by WITF's Scott Lamar. So if you're interested, if you participate in the Splendid and the Vile, and you're very pumped about learning more about what Mr. Larson has done over the years, please join us, participate in that event on April 18th. Okay, on March 2nd at 7 p.m., we will be welcoming back the Writers' Roundtable at the History Center, Historical Society Museum. We'll be welcoming Charles Stanbaugh, who will be discussing Forest Park and the origins and development of the York County trolley system. On March 5th, Sunday, March 5th at 2:30 p.m., the South Central Genealogical Society will be coming back and welcoming Tyler Stump of the Pennsylvania State Archives, who will be discussing doing research with Pennsylvania prison records. And then on second Saturday, March 11th, our second Saturday event will be Tom Davidson, who will be speaking about the very popular, very famous Malin Haines and the Shoe House, which you can't miss every time you're driving on Route 30 toward Wrightsville or toward York. It's right up there, recently taken over and reconverted into its original purpose, which was a bed and breakfast, more of an Airbnb sort of situation. But that's what he built it for, in addition to the obvious advertising. So please come on March 11th to hear Tom Davidson, who's done a lot of research on the Lincoln Highway. One final announcement before I introduce tonight's speaker. Obviously, you're all thinking, so what are we going to do next month for the roundtable? So a month from tonight, March 15th, again at 7 p.m., we will be returning to an in-person event at the History Center. It will also be live streamed on Zoom. And we will be welcoming Randy Dreas, who will be presenting Women at Gettysburg. Most, if not all, Battle of Gettysburg buffs have heard of Jenny Wade, the only civilian killed during the Battle of Gettysburg, and women such as Lydia Leister, whose home was used as General Meade's headquarters, Mary Thompson, whose home was used as General Lee's headquarters, and others like Tilly Pierce and Elizabeth Thorne. But what about the many other women who were there during or after the battle? Join amateur historian Randy Dreas as we learn not only more about the well-known women, but also the lesser-known ones like Marie Tape or French Mary, Cornelia Hancock, Catherine Hagen, Lucinda Horn, Rose Quinn Rooney, and many more. So that event is taking place just 4 weeks from tonight. And without further ado, I'd like to present tonight's speaker. James Hessler has worked as a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg National Military Park for 2 decades. He has authored or co-authored 3 full-length books on the Gettysburg Campaign: Sickles at Gettysburg, 2009, Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, 2015, and Gettysburg's Peach Orchard in 2019. His books received several distinguished book awards. Jim currently co-hosts the popular Battle of Gettysburg podcast. His other media appearances include the Travel Channel, C-SPAN, NPR, PCN TV, Breitbart News, and other outlets. He has also authored articles in Gettysburg Magazine, America's Civil War, and Hollowed Ground Magazine. He was one of the primary content designers for the American Battlefield Trust's mobile Gettysburg application. He is a
You know what, Adam? If you want to stop there, you probably can in the interest of time here.
I can do so. All right, well, thank you very much. We'll let Jim take over here in a second. And if you could hold on to your questions till the end, if you want to throw them into the chat when they come up, please feel free to do so. And I will see everyone in a little bit.
Okay, and I think that's my cue to take over.
Yes.
So give me a minute here, folks, while I'm going to share my screen and get my presentation up here. I see some familiar faces in the audience, so thank you all for coming out here tonight. And always the most stressful part of the evening, just to make sure that the tech works correctly. So give me a second here while I try to go full screen. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully everybody can see my screen and hear me okay. Thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks for those of you who are also watching on Facebook Live. And I do also want to express my own condolences to the friends and family of both Dick and Bill. Dick in particular was a friend of mine, and I knew Dick well, and I can still see his smiling face in attendance tonight, even if he's not with us. So my condolences there. Okay, so what am I going to do tonight? I'm going to do Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, and a specific topic in terms of what was Lee thinking when he ordered that doomed assault on July 3rd, 1863. And I want to be clear at the outset, I don't want to presume any arrogant presumption here that I can actually know or pretend to know what Robert E. Lee was thinking that day. As you'll note, the title is actually in quotes, what was Lee thinking? So what I am trying to do as a Gettysburg battlefield guide, an author, a Gettysburg historian, I'm trying to address what is easily one of the most commonly received questions that we get on the battlefield when we're discussing July 3rd and what we call Pickett's charge. And people will often ask, geez, what was Robert E. Lee thinking? So I'm really trying to approach it tonight from that angle. Again, I don't want anybody to think I'm arrogant enough to really get inside Robert E. Lee's head. In addition to that, though, I want to issue another disclaimer up front. This is not an apology session, nor is it an attempt to make any excuses for anything Lee or any of the other participants did at the Battle of Gettysburg. This is as a historian trying to understand what happened and really get to the bottom of the matter. So just want to kind of address that up front first. Okay, so obviously Gettysburg is a popular topic. I see my friend Randy Dreas is coming in next month with another Gettysburg topic. So we all know Gettysburg, why it generates so much enthusiasm among Civil War historians. But why Pickett's charge? The book that I'm talking about tonight, Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, that I co-wrote with Wayne Motz and was released in 2015. When that book first came out, I have to be honest, as a Gettysburg historian, I kind of thought at that time that maybe a lot of people kind of felt like they knew Pickett's charge, that it was boring. It was a boring, simple, straightforward frontal assault. And what I found when we were doing the initial promotion for that book, even though I had already been a battlefield guide for many years before that, was that Pickett's charge can still very much bring up some passions, some hostilities, and some strong opinions about what did and what didn't happen on July 3rd. So I've found from personal experience that it remains a very contentious topic. And I would argue one that is still not well understood. We spend way too much time focusing on trees, whether it be the copse of trees or Ziegler's Grove. I'm here to say tonight that neither one of those is key to understanding the assault. So we'll talk about that. From a military history perspective, the charge, which was the center point of Lee's strategy on July 3rd, is the turning point of the Battle of Gettysburg. And what we mean by that is, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army, they have the ability to wage war prior to July 3rd. They do not have the ability to do it after July 3rd. They have to retreat and withdraw. And because of that, we think it makes a compelling case that the failure of the charge is the turning point of the battle, and therefore it's still an important topic worth studying. But last but not least, and as you can see on screen here, I've got images from two very distinct reunions. One, of course, in the top left is one of the famous hands across the wall images of veterans on the field, North and South, literally shaking hands across the wall. The image on the bottom one, though, is on the bottom side is a personal image taken at the 150th anniversary of July of 2013. And at that particular anniversary, the National Park Service did a rewalk of Pickett's Charge. Tens of thousands of people showed up. Possibly more people walked the charge in 2013 than actually did in 2016. In 1863. And so what it really kind of demonstrated to me and reminded me was that it is still, for lack of a better word, a very popular action. And I think a lot of ways its popularity and its symbolism transcends the battle. So you put all that together and think Pickett's Charge is still a worthy topic here. Okay, so I'm not going to start tonight in 1863. I'm going to start actually in 1957. And this is a picture taken at the base of the Virginia State Memorial, the iconic monument on the battlefield that to many people represents Pickett's Charge. And you can see in the image here, Dwight Eisenhower, Ike, and Montgomery, Monty, standing at the monument, looking out across the field and also talking to the press. And during this visit in 1957, Monty caused a little bit of a stir with the press, the American press, when he said that he would have sacked both Lee and Meade following Pickett's Charge. Now you can say, well, geez, I understand why maybe he would have thought he would have sacked Lee. He also would have sacked Meade for, in Monty's words, quote unquote, not having control of the situation. Well, this caused a little bit of a stir among the American press. As a result, obviously, the press tried to draw an opinion out of Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a little more astute and kind of said, no, you're not going to draw me into that. But at the same time, Ike, who by 1957 had become really a studied Gettysburg enthusiast in his own right, said, he didn't really understand why Lee had ordered the assault and kind of assumed that Lee was so mad that he, quote unquote, must have wanted to hit them with a brick. And I've always found that story amusing and frankly, a little fascinating, because in part what it kind of tells me is, or it's symbolic to me of this history that we have of people standing at the Virginia Memorial and not truly understanding what was Lee thinking on July 3rd when he ordered that assault. So as I said in the outset, that's the approach I'm kind of taking here. And I think the Ike and Monty story, two guys who, were so instrumental in ending World War II, struggling to understand Pickett's Charge of 1863. So this is the view. This is the view from the Virginia Monument. And we probably, all of us, have been there and done that. And we've all gone to Gettysburg. And again, many of us have stood on the field. We've looked out across that mile of open ground, whether you're here on the Confederate side, looking towards Cemetery Ridge, or on Cemetery Ridge, looking over at us. Either way, it doesn't really matter. But so many people have come in and shaken their head and kind of taken that view in and said, what was Lee thinking? What was he thinking? That had to have been a suicidal charge. Nobody could possibly make that charge. It was doomed to fail. Maybe Robert E. Lee wasn't feeling well that day, or, how could he not understand frontal assaults and what was then modern weaponry? These are all common opinions, questions, perceptions, that any armchair general almost immediately goes to when they start to think of this assault. We, of course, know how it ended. We, of course, know that it more or less turned out to be a disaster for Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. But when that decision was made late morning, early afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, to pursue this course of action, of course, that decision was still very much in doubt. And that's the piece we've got to remember. So now let's go back to 1863 and start thinking about, okay, what was Lee thinking? How did this kind of all come together? And I always start with a couple quotations from Colonel Armstead Long, who was Robert E. Lee's military secretary, because I do find the quote to be rather perceptive and accurate. Long wrote, in 1886 that, quote, the attack of Pickett's division has been more criticized and yet still less understood than any other act of the Gettysburg drama. It was not ordered without mature consideration and on grounds that presented fair prospects of success. So folks, throw away this Gettysburg movie idea that Lee, kind of in a daze or in a trance, kind of desperately throws his army against Cemetery Ridge. Throw that away. This was put together with a lot of planning. Some of it worked, much of it didn't, but at least on grounds that they thought at the time presented fair prospects of success. And I do think Long is right, when he says that. So let's do a quick situation report. You might ask yourself, well, why would Lee even want to attack on July 3rd? And the simple answer there is because after 2 days of battle, he was clearly not feeling defeated. July 1st, and these are quotations from Lee's report, July 1st, encouraged by the successful issue of the first day, and in view of the valuable results that would ensue from defeating General Meade's army, it was thought advisable to renew the attack. Okay, July 1st, pretty much considered a Confederate victory north and west of town. And what you have to remember is defeating the Army of the Potomac is an objective of Lee's. So he feels like he's on that road after July 1st. Contact with the enemy has thus set the stage for continued action. Okay. So July 1st leads into the bigger and bloodier July 2nd. Little Round Top, the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, all the fighting that we know that goes on July 2nd. When it was over, Lee wrote that partial successes determined me to continue the assault the next day. With proper concert of action and with increased support that positions gained on the right would enable the artillery, we should ultimately succeed, and it was determined to continue the attack. Folks, that's a very important passage there under July 2nd. Partial successes, concert of action, increased support from the positions gained on the right. We should succeed, and it was determined to continue the attack. And so what I've highlighted on the map are the partial successes that Lee referred to. Top right, where you see Culp's Hill highlighted on the map, Lee's army, Ewell's Second Corps in particular, have gained a foothold at the bottom of Culp's Hill when the fighting ends on July 2nd. Meanwhile, down at the bottom of the map, where I've circled areas under where it says Law and Devil's Den, and just above that, the Peach Orchard, what you're seeing there is ground that Longstreet had gained on the Confederate right or the Union left. And in part of that, and part of gaining that ground, Longstreet is going to be able to advance some artillery positions when he moves from July 2nd into July 3rd. So those are the partial successes on the flanks. Culp's Hill on one flank and Peach Orchard, Emmitsburg Road on the Union left or the Confederate right. Okay, lest we not forget the other side here. As probably many of us know, there is a War Council meeting at Meade's headquarters on the evening of July 2nd. Meade and his subordinates famously agree to more or less stay and fight it out. There is a famous quote attributed to George Meade where he tells John Gibbon, if Lee attacks tomorrow, it will be on your front because he has made attacks on our flanks, failed, and if he tries again, it will be on the center. That's a quote that comes to us from Gibbon. Meade, though, also later testified that he did have a concern that Lee might try to move on his left and rear to cut off the Taneytown Road and or the Baltimore Pike. And you see some of that in Meade's movements. You see some of that in Meade's movements on the early morning of July 3rd, where Meade is actually going to make some moves to strengthen that left flank. And we'll talk about those in a minute. So Meade and the Union Army, they're very active. They're also going to decide to make a move to recapture some of that ground over at Culp's Hill. So they're very active, but in essence, though, they have committed to staying on a defense, which does leave the strategic offense to Robert E. Lee. And frankly, that's why so many of us end up talking about what Lee does on July 3rd more than what Meade does. Okay, so Robert E. Lee and his battle report, one of his battle reports, July 3rd. The general plan was unchanged. Longstreet, reinforced by Pickett, was ordered to attack the next morning, and General Ewell was directed to assault the enemy's right at the same time. Longstreet, Ewell, both to attack the next morning, same time. Okay, that goes back to what I said on the previous slide about the flanks. So we presume that's what Lee means, simultaneous attacks, but Lee probably realizes that uncoordinated attacks from Longstreet and Ewell on July 2nd had only gained at best partial success. And so Lee is committed on July 3rd to having the two sides attack at the same time, coordinate, cooperate, and presumably prevent Meade from throwing reinforcements from one end of the line to the other. This is Lee's initial plan for the 3rd. But why does it go wrong? Well, it starts as early as 4:30 in the morning at Culp's Hill. Quote on screen from Richard Ewell's report. He says, I was ordered to attack at daylight on Friday morning. He also talks about being reinforced overnight, which shows you that the Confederates thought they could take advantage of Culp's Hill. He talks about getting reinforced. Just before the time fixed for our advance, however, the enemy attacked. And half an hour afterwards, when it was too late to recall Johnson's division, Ewell received notice that Longstreet would not attack until 10 o'clock. But as it turned out, his attack was delayed until after 2 o'clock, and actually probably closer to 3 o'clock. So right off the bat, it's 4:30 in the morning. Lee's plans for July 3rd are starting to go astray. And it's because the gentleman here, that handsome guy next to Ewell, Plug Ugly himself, Alpheus Williams of the Union Army 12th Corps, was one of the leadership of the 12th Corps who had insisted on trying to get his Culp's Hill positions back from General Ewell. So again, we're not really here tonight to talk about Culp's Hill in any great depth, but I do want to call out Williams as really an unsung Union Army hero on July 3rd because of the role he has in starting the assault at Culp's Hill and really starting to take some of that initiative away from what Lee and his lieutenants planned. Okay, so Ewell's engaged at Culp's Hill, 4:30 in the morning, going to go on for about 7 hours, probably as late as 11:30 or so in the morning, when, as many of us know, ultimately Ewell and Confederate attempts to get to the top of Culp's Hill fail and are pushed back. Meanwhile, though, over on the other end of the field, as Lee tells us, General Longstreet's dispositions were not completed as early as expected. Before notice could be sent to General Ewell, he had already become engaged at Culp's Hill, and it was too late to recall him. Okay, so now you have almost a repeat situation of what didn't fully work on July 2nd. One flank attacks, gets repulsed. The other flank attacks, gets repulsed. So I think Lee realizes, okay, I'm not going to repeat separate uncoordinated attacks from the prior day, so I've got to look for an alternative. And Longstreet, by the way, admits this in his report. He says that he was making arrangements for renewing the attack by the Confederate right, which a view to pass around the hills occupied by the enemy on the left. That could be a reference to Big Round Top, Little Round Top, or both, and to gain it by flank and reverse attack. So Longstreet admits he was looking to try to get around the hills and gain it in flank and reverse. Folks, that might be a great idea. Unfortunately, though, what Longstreet never acknowledges is that position behind the Round Tops by the morning of July 3rd actually was occupied by enemy troops. About 3,400 men from Wright and Howe's brigades in the 6th Corps, along with a couple batteries of artillery, were actually in position behind the Round Tops. And this goes back to what I said on a previous slide about George Meade strengthening his left flank early that morning. This is part of it. And so that way around the Confederate right that Longstreet always talks about wasn't actually as open as he would have made it out to be. But in any event, what this really means for Lee is now all of his flank options are kind of being taken off the table. You know, we talked about Ewell at Culp's Hill, but Longstreet isn't ready to attack the Union left when Lee wants him to. And if Longstreet is really going to pass around the Round Tops, that hill is not, that area is not as open and unopposed as Longstreet would often tell us that it was. So at that point, if you can't hit the flanks, what are your options? Well, going back to my situation report page, given the fact that Lee is not feeling defeated and is actually considered that he's had 2 days of some success, the option to do nothing really isn't seriously considered. So what we really got to do is we really got to look for what I call plan B. And I want to be careful here. I'm not saying Lee ever referred to this as plan B, just for the sake of simplicity. I'm kind of calling this plan B. And so if you can't attack the flanks, where else are you going to go? Well, Armistead Long, Lee's military secretary, who we met a few slides ago, Long wrote that Cemetery Ridge was at every point strongly occupied by the Federals. However, there was a weak point upon which an attack could be made with a reasonable prospect of success. And this was where the ridge, sloping west, formed through the depression which the Emmitsburg Road runs through, okay? Perceiving that by forcing the Federal lines at that point and turning towards Cemetery Hill, the right would be taken in flank, the remainder would be neutralized, and General Lee determined to attack at that point. And I'm putting a little emphasis on this because obviously in the whole schema of what was Lee thinking, what was Lee trying to accomplish, for years and years, and especially in recent years too, a lot of ink has been spilled over whether or not Cemetery Ridge was the target, whether or not Cemetery Hill was the target. You know, it kind of goes hand in hand with trying to understand what Lee is trying to accomplish. Long tells us that Cemetery Ridge was the target. The use of the word target in parentheses is mine, not his. He tells us Cemetery Ridge was the target. He then tells us that they turned towards Cemetery, or they would have turned towards Cemetery Hill as an objective. And you can have both Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill. But there's been kind of this notion proposed, especially in recent years, that somehow the Confederates intended to go to Cemetery Hill, and because of confusion, because of getting crowded on the flanks, because of the fog of war, the attack somehow ended up going to the wrong point. And I think that's preposterous. I get it. People focus on trees. We've got an image here of the copse of trees, what that would have looked like shortly after the war. Not very big, not very prominent. People want this idea that they were going towards trees, so they must have been going towards the more prominent Ziegler's Grove at Cemetery Hill. Trees are at best a guiding landmark. Cemetery Ridge was the objective target, which the majority of this attack was aimed for. And we got, not only does Long tell us that, but I've got a couple other reasons on screen why that makes sense. First of all, when we show you Longstreet's troop dispositions, I'll show you that that's where the weight of the attack is directed at. The other thing too you got to ask yourself is, can that point be reached? And the answer is yes. On July 2nd, Wright's Georgia Brigade temporarily gained a foothold in and around that area. I'm not saying it was for very long, but they were ultimately repulsed due to lack of support and just basically overwhelmed by superior numbers. But that July 2nd action showed that if you could get there, the question is, can you hold it? And so what I think Lee is trying to do is, okay, we'll concentrate on this with bigger numbers and we'll see if we can hold it. The other thing you got to ask yourself too is, would Cemetery Hill be able to be taken with a direct assault? And I think between the elevation and the artillery, that answer is probably not. So I think you put all of this together in addition to what Long said on the last slide, and I think it's a pretty compelling case that yes, folks, Cemetery Ridge, don't focus on the copse of trees, but that Cemetery Ridge is the target of the attack. Okay, so what I've got on this slide here is sort of Longstreet's troop dispositions as they are lining up prior to the assault. This is one of our maps, Steve Stanley's maps from our Pickett's Charge book. And what I've tried to highlight here is you go down the length of the line, Pettigrew's division here in front, Trimble's half division behind him, and then you have parts of Pickett's division, Garnett, Armistead, and Kemper's brigade isn't on the slide right now. It's kind of off to the bottom. But what I wanted to show you, and what I talked about this on the last page, is the positioning of the troops is important to understanding the target. All of us, we're always guilty of saying, well, so-and-so wrote this in the 1880s and so said this in the 1890s kind of thing. And really, you can twist accounts to kind of support any position you want. But the theory that I'm using here is consistent with how Longstreet deploys the troops. And nobody looks at that hard enough. They always just look at the post-war accounts. Trimble's two brigades, which are in line behind Pettigrew, Trimble's two brigades are put in position behind Pettigrew's right, not his left. And that's important because those troops will be directed, and this is where you can follow the arrow, towards Cemetery Ridge, in that area today that many of us probably know as the Abraham Bryan farm. He's not directed towards Cemetery Hill, which would be all the way up here on the top of the map. So that's what you got to think about, the depth of the attack. Longstreet, like many Civil War generals, likes to attack in depth. And the depth of this attack, the second line, is directed towards Cemetery Ridge. Same thing goes true in Pickett's division. Armistead coming in behind Garnett's left. Where are they going to end up? Cemetery Ridge. If they're directed to Cemetery Hill, they got to end up all the way up here. How are you going to do that? This is where these guys are directed. And last but not least, on Pettigrew's line, you've got Fry's brigade, kind of here, the Tennessee and Alabama regiments, where I'm kind of pivoting my cursor right now. You have Fry's brigade on Pettigrew's left and Garnett's brigade, I'm sorry, on Pettigrew's right. On Pettigrew's right. I'm reading it upside down on a map. You've got Fry's brigade on Pettigrew's right. You've got Garnett's brigade on Pickett's left. And both of these guys think they are guiding on each other as they head towards Cemetery Ridge. And where do both of those brigades go? Towards the high water mark, the angle, the copse of trees as we know it today. So I think the positioning of the troops tells us a lot of the story. And, it's no accident that Longstreet positions the troops like that. He wants the attack to smash into Cemetery Ridge and then have that second line there to back it up. In fact, only on the Confederate left, opposite Cemetery Hill, is one of the weakest brigades on the field, Brockenbrow's Virginia brigades. It's one of the weakest ones on the field. If you're really attacking towards Cemetery Hill, then somebody has really made a serious error in the troop alignments. And think about that. Okay, so we'll come back to some of this. Artillery, can't say it enough. Artillery, big part of the assault here, big part in understanding what they're trying to accomplish. So what did I tell you before? Some of the partial successes from July 2nd, some of the ground gained on the Confederate right, the Peach Orchard, the Emmitsburg Road corridor. Look what's happening by the morning and early afternoon of July 3rd. This area is ringed with Confederate batteries, Confederate artillery. All of this area was under Union control the previous day, Dan Sickles. When Sickles was pushed back from the Emmitsburg Road, Longstreet and Porter Alexander brought up the Confederate batteries along this corridor. And what they're hoping is that with the ground gained by Longstreet, combining with other Confederate batteries in position to the west of the Union line and to the north, what the Confederate artillery is doing is they're hoping they can converge fire onto the Union position from multiple directions. Lee tells us that Longstreet's batteries were placed in positions which it was believed would silence those of the enemy. But it's not just Longstreet. Hill and Ewell were ordered to open simultaneously. And the assaulting column was to advance under cover of the combined fire of the three. The batteries were directed to be pushed forward as the infantry progressed, protecting the flanks, supporting the attack closely. So again, when we think of artillery prior to Pickett's charge, we often think of the very noisy, the very visually spectacular 2-hour cannonade that goes on prior to the assault. But in the original conception, that wasn't what was supposed to happen. We were supposed to get Longstreet Hill and Ewell opening simultaneously. Assaulting column will advance under cover of their fire, and then the batteries would be pushed forward to protect the flanks and support the attack. That's the plan. Might not work out that way, but that's the plan. And this is kind of just, again, a visual representation of that. The arrows, again, representing the infantry as they head towards Cemetery Ridge. And what I've done is I've highlighted on the flanks some of the positioning of the batteries. Many of these batteries, especially up here on West Confederate Avenue today, still on the field today. You can go and kind of examine some of these firing positions for yourself. But this is a visual representation of that, how the batteries positioned heavily on the infantry flanks were supposed to support the great attack. And it didn't go well for the Confederates. Henry Hunt, generally acknowledged as one of the great Union heroes of the day, and he certainly is for his management of the Union batteries. But at the same time, too, what hindsight shows us is that Lee ultimately overestimated the value of the ground gained by Longstreet. And although they hoped to converge fire with my red arrows onto Cemetery Ridge, Union batteries in that fishhook, which are my blue arrows, were basically able to return fire and basically prevent the Confederate batteries from overpowering their counterparts at the target. And so Alexander kind of tells us that. He says, the vicinity of the peach orchard was very unfavorable ground for us, generally sloping towards the enemy. The open ridge line exposed all of our movements to the enemy's view and artillery fire. Whereas at the same time, some of these Union batteries on lower Cemetery Ridge, what today would be Hancock Avenue, are actually at times well concealed and well hidden. So they thought the ground gained by Longstreet on July 2nd would be a key to making this decisive, and they were wrong. And we know that again in hindsight. But another myth of the charge is the idea that the cannonade was totally ineffective. That would probably be an overstatement. The concentrated Confederate fire into the Cemetery Ridge area where the assault is going to be directed, that concentrated fire does produce some of the highest Union artillery casualties in the entire Battle of Gettysburg. Hazard's Second Corps batteries with guys who were in and around the angle, Cushing, Rorty, Woodruff, up by the Bryan farm, they suffer the highest artillery losses in the Army of the Potomac, almost 25% casualties, which for artillery is pretty high. So it's not to say that the cannonade or the Confederate artillery was totally ineffective, just not effective enough, and certainly didn't accomplish what Lee felt he needed to make this attack work. Which leaves young Porter Alexander with a dilemma. When he started the assault, he had not specifically intended for the cannonade to go on for several hours. And there's a series of notes that go back between Alexander and Longstreet to the effect of, Colonel Alexander, when the artillery has had the effect, you decide when to give the word and we'll bring Pickett's men forward. But as Alexander later wrote, I was going to give Pickett the order to advance within 15 or 20 minutes, but I couldn't find the opportunity, and it seemed madness to launch infantry into that fire with nearly 3/4 of a mile to go at midday under a July sun. And because Alexander can't get that advantage, which we talked a little bit about on this slide, because Alexander can't get that advantage, the minutes start to tick away. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 75 minutes. It starts to tick away. And the problem is, the longer that clock runs down, it's the Confederates who, remember, need to conserve ammunition to support this attack. It's the Confederates who start to run low on ammunition because of this long, drawn out attack. And that leaves Porter Alexander with a real dilemma. I can't order Pickett to come forward while the Yankee batteries are still there, but the longer this goes on, leaves us with less ammunition to support the attack. And that's a real problem and a dilemma that ultimately is going to haunt the Confederates on this day. Eventually, Alexander think he's going to see a slackening of the Union return fire. He's going to fire off a couple of notes to Pickett, for God's sakes, come quick, or my ammunition will not be able to let me support you. And Pickett will receive Alexander's note. He's going to take it to Longstreet, say, General, shall I advance? And according to Longstreet, Longstreet later wrote that, this was one of the saddest days of his life because he knew the attack was going to fail. All he could do, according to Longstreet, was bow his head in emotion and kind of wave Pickett forward. And it was at that moment that Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble, and the assembled men under them marched forward to meet their destiny. But as they're marching forward, Confederate artillery, in many cases, is now either out of ammunition or low enough on ammunition that they don't have enough guns to really support the flanks. And by our count afterwards, Alexander's only going to have about nine guns that are going to move forward in the assault. Clearly not what Lee had intended when he ordered it. And so this is an image of the famed Elliott burial map, which kind of shows you the cost. Many of you are probably familiar with the Elliott map. It was a map that was plotted in early 1864, trying to represent where mass graves were on the battlefield. And the bottom line is, although we don't think the Elliott map is exactly precise in terms of numbers, I'm trying to give you an idea where bodies were concentrated afterwards. And I think this gives you a good idea of concentration, if nothing else. And so what you see is heavy casualties, particularly as the assaulting column reaches the Emmitsburg Road. And Major Thomas Osborne of the 11th Corps Union Artillery says, the enemy's march was splendid. And for a considerable distance, the only hindrance offered it was by the artillery, Federal artillery, which broke their lines fearfully. Another account says more graphically that they would be throwing artillery into the advancing infantry, and out of the dust clouds, arms, heads, blankets, guns, knapsacks were thrown into the air. Very much not the romantic image of Pickett's charge that probably many of us would prefer, but the reality of war and the ugliness of the situation here. Finally, though, as the infantry, in some great numbers, still did reach the Emmitsburg Road, which is a compliment to them. General Alexander Hayes, one of the Union generals on the line, wrote that when within 100 yards, the fire of our men could no longer be constrained. 4 lines rose from behind our stone wall, and before the smoke of our first volley had cleared away, the enemy, in dismay and consternation, were seeking safety in flight. Every attempt by their officers to rally them was in vain. So really, we're getting the 1-2 punch there. The artillery and now the infantry, as you get into closer range, really sending the Confederates back in defeat. But was it as one-sided as most modern histories and most battlefield interpretations often make it? And when I lead battlefield tours, one of the comments I always make is, when we lead battlefield tours of Pickett's charge, in a lot of ways, we're very unintentionally guilty of making it one-sided. We talk about Confederate casualties. Armstead goes down, Garnett goes down, Kemper is wounded, James Marshall goes down. We tend to focus on the Confederate casualties as if the bullets are only flying in one particular direction. But, that does a disservice to the Union men who lose their lives, killed, wounded, missing, captured during the assault. We estimated there might be as many as 2,000 Union casualties on July 3rd. Again, something that people often don't often factor in. And Alexander Webb, who defended the angle, wrote his wife on July 6th that when the Confederates came over the fence, the Army of the Potomac was nearer being whipped than it was at any other time of the battle. Well, again, we always make it sound like it's a lopsided defeat. And here you have the guy defending the troops at the angle saying, at least for a moment, he felt like the army was nearer being whipped than it was at any other time during the battle. But again, casualties, look, there's casualties at all level. We lose Hancock at the corps level. Gibbon at the division level is wounded. Brigade level, guys like Sherrill, regiments, artillery batteries, a fair number of high-level commanders on the Union side are taken out of action on July 3rd. And even for a while, the Army loses communication with George Meade as he has to move his headquarters to Powers Hill. And for a while, the commander of the Army is out of touch. So there is an opportunity here to create a little bit of chaos within the Army of the Potomac. And again, something most people almost would never think about, the idea of there being Union soldiers captured during the charge, Confederates taking prisoners. And we have a number of accounts of this. Private in the 69th Pennsylvania near the copse of trees says one entire company hustled over the stone wall into the enemy and all were captured. A major in Garnett's brigade says we captured some prisoners. A guy in the 56th Virginia says, don't shoot. Union guys cried out, don't shoot, we surrender. And were ordered back into the rear unescorted. And possibly my favorite account comes from Sergeant Major William Stockton, 22-year-old from Philly. He says, the enemy came in great numbers. There was a giant boulder which formed a sort of stepping stone, which made it easy for them to get over the wall. And they came over the wall in overwhelming numbers. They came with such a force that they seemed to rebound and go back like a wave receding from the shore. And as they went back, they took us with them. And I think Stockton's account is the coolest way of saying I surrendered and got captured without coming out and saying I surrendered and got captured. I mean, the Confederates came over like a wave and their wave receded and took me with them, kind of thing. Stockton, I love you, but just admit that you got captured. The point being, though, going back to what I was saying in the previous slides, is it as one-sided as we always make it out to be? There are these intangibles that we as armchair generals simply can't recreate. Fear, chaos, confusion, things of that nature. And if the Army of Northern Virginia can instill enough panic and fear in the Army of the Potomac, then an assault like this can work. And that's part of what they're going for. Andrew Cowan, commander of a Union battery, has one of my favorite anecdotes. First of all, he says, he acknowledges that in his view, good number of the 69th Pennsylvania ran away. Officers among them, as I saw plainly, and cursed them. One of them was a captain. He ran like a turkey with a sword tucked under his arm and his face distorted with fear. A corporal near me was raging mad and swore at him like a pirate. I saw him pick up from the ground a Dutch coffee pot, and he smashed it on the head of one of the runaways. The bottom broke in, but that fellow went on running with the tin pot down on his ears. And again, a Civil War image we often don't think about. I'm pretty sure if you go back and watch the movie Gettysburg, there was no guy running away with a coffee pot smashed in over his head, but this was the reality of it. You can get a moment of fear in the defenses, and if that fear can take hold, you can exploit that advantage. Cowan also said on a more serious note that in my front, it is no exaggeration to say the dead lay in heaps. Our own soldiers covered the ground where the battery fought, and beyond the wall, my own canister had done terrible execution. So he talks about the dead on both sides being piled up at the stone wall. And so, as we know, again, with the hindsight of history, the attack failed. Now, that night, as legend tells us, Robert E. Lee met with one of his generals and said, it's too bad. The attacks, they were not properly supported. I don't understand why, but the attacks were not properly supported. And Lee had also famously said, as the men were coming back, that it was all my fault. Well, this idea of not being properly supported has led to years and years and decades of conspiracy theories. Virginia versus North Carolina. Did Pettigrew's North Carolinians give way and not support Pickett? And Lee, that story has has fed into these conspiracy theories for all these years. While I can't dispute that, Lee, in two of his battle reports, pretty explicitly says what he thinks went wrong. And in his July 31st report and in his January 1864 report, both times, I don't want to use the word blame, but both times he really blames it on the artillery. July 31st, our troops succeeded in entering the enemy's works, but our artillery, having nearly expended its ammunition, the attacking columns became exposed to the heavy fire of the batteries near the summit and were compelled to relinquish their advantage and fall back with severe loss. And Lee basically reiterates that in his January 1864 report, but he adds a few other phrases. Our own artillery, having nearly exhausted their ammunition in the protracted cannonade, were unable to reply or render the necessary support to the attacking party. Owing to this fact, which was unknown to me when the assault took place. Well, that's an interesting moment there. Lee is saying, okay, we were out of ammunition, and this was not known to me when the attack took place. And you can kind of wonder, was there a scenario here where nobody wanted to be the guy to tell Lee that there wasn't enough ammunition left? You can wonder that. Owing to this fact, which was unknown to me when the assault took place, the enemy threw a strong force of infantry against our left, already waving under a concentrated fire of artillery, and it finally gave way. And so again, I said at the outset, artillery is important to understanding the real story here. This is part of the story. And in Lee's mind, this is the piece that didn't work out. And he mentioned it again on two occasions, within 6 months of the battle. Okay, so let's take it to our after action assessment report as we wrap up here, and then I'll open it up to questions. Well, in later years, George Pickett, at a dinner party, supposedly after he'd probably had a few drinks, was asked, General Pickett, tell us what happened at Gettysburg. And as probably most of you know, Pickett famously said, well, I think the Yankees had something to do with it. And there's no doubt the Yankees did have something to do with it. And we should give Meade, Hayes, Webb, Hancock, Gibbon, all the enlisted men, Hunt, and the artillery, the credit that they deserve. But at a really basic level, you can kind of break this down into pieces. What went wrong? Federal artillery broke up the Confederate formations in the morale. Confederate artillery was unable to support the attack or protect the flanks as envisioned. Weak flanks then allowed the Federal infantry to envelop both ends of the Confederate line, and ultimately the concert of action between Lee, Hill, Ewell, infantry, artillery, all this concert of action that Lee envisioned ultimately failed. And I think, this could have worked, but it was a scenario where everything had to go right. And in this case, multiple things don't go right. But the next time you go to Gettysburg and you stand at the Virginia Monument and you say to yourself, that was suicide. How did he order that? Remember one more thing. For the second day in a row, Confederate infantry did reach and gain the desired ground. So that's 2 days in a row, 2 out of 3, folks. Confederate infantry did reach the desired ground, but ultimately didn't have the strength in numbers to hold it. And I can talk more about that in the question and answer if we need to. So this is the part where I wish we were in person. We could reconvene to the back of the room and sell my Pickett books and my Sickles and my Peach Orchard books. But I will put in a plug here before we go to question and answer. The Pickett's Charge book is just back in print, which is one of the reasons why I'm out talking tonight. All of my books are for sale at a lot of places, including the Battle of Gettysburg podcast.com, which is my website. So if you're interested, I know many of you in the audience, because again, I see some familiar names already own these books. But if you don't, I'd be happy if you check them out. And obviously the Pickett book talks about what I talked about tonight and goes into it in greater depth and detail. I think it's a nice book. So with that, Adam, I know we do have some questions on the Q&A. Should I turn it over to you at this point, or do we co-share
Sure.
how this works?
Sure. I can read the questions to you if that works.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you for an excellent presentation. And yeah, it clarified a lot of things that a few things I had misthought, but also confirmed a lot of things. I used to reenact Union artillery, and
Okay.
so I always like to hear people say that the Union artillery kind of won the Battle of Gettysburg. So
Yeah, definitely played a
maybe a
big
bit
part.
of an overstatement, but still. Anyway, okay. So we have a few comments here from Bill Landis, who is a longtime Zoom member of the Roundtable. He has a few comments to make. He said that Jim, your book and Wayne's book is the most thorough and best done book of its kind. Re Gettysburg, any Gettysburg site of action. So
Thank you. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's very kind of you.
yeah. He has some specific questions. Number one, Jeff Shara identified a Mississippi plaque in the ground as the Confederate high watermark, Mississippi 11th by the Bryan Barn. I have tramped the area and cannot find it. It is not the Mississippi statue monument or statue/monument. Can you help with that?
Yeah, I presume, and again, thanks for the question in the comments. I presume you're talking about the Mississippi marker, that it is just on the other side of the stone wall, and it is just if you're on the other side of the stone wall, it would be just to the right of the Bryan Barn, kind of on the south side of the barn, if you're kind of looking at this at a north-south orientation. So it's there. It's kind of on the line with the 26 North Carolina little monument, which is further down, but again, also on that same side of the stone wall. And and again, these things, they kind of foster a lot of this rivalry over who got the farthest during Pickett's charge and all of that, which I think is a shame. I think every side did their part.
Thank you. His second question is, do you recommend me getting the Batchelder papers? Would it be worth? I'm guessing he means for research or
Yeah. I mean, if you're hardcore enough, absolutely, I would recommend the Batchelder papers to anybody. I have my set is well worn and I love them. They are great primary resources, primary reference material. Both sides, they're slanted more towards the Union, but they have accounts from both sides. Batchelder papers, yes. There's also a 1-volume Batchelder's History of the Battle of Gettysburg, which I could kind of take it or leave it. I don't think that's as informative, but absolutely the Batchelder papers, 3 volumes. I know 3 volumes will set you back a little bit, but if you're serious about Gettysburg, you got to get them.
All right, great. This next question is from Jeff Stauffer. What role, if any, do you think that the explosion of the Richmond Armory in the weeks prior to the battles, which temporarily shut down production, and the need to substitute fuses from Charleston, played in the limited effectiveness of the cannonade?
Good question.
Yep. My understanding is the fuses used at Gettysburg by the ANV did not burn at the same rate as previous actions due to the substitution of fuses.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off before the question was over. It's good question, Jeff. It's one that we get a lot on the topic. And while I certainly think that was a factor, certainly when you compare just general quality of Confederate artillery to Union artillery, really all over the battlefield. But, obviously we're talking about Pickett's charge tonight. The other piece, though, that I think plays into the cannonade really goes back to what I said on the slide about the lack of value of the Emmitsburg Road in the Peach Orchard area. And I think Alexander kind of tells us, the kind of the sloping terrain. I think I think, you know, they're closer to the Union position than they were on July 2nd. I think it takes the Confederates a while to get the range on their opponents, so to speak. So yeah, well, I think certainly the quality and that fire and everything that went along with that plays a part in this. I would also I would throw into that people often don't think enough about the terrain and the effect that that played on it as well. And I think in my opinion, it's those two factors put together that contributed to you know, the lack of effectiveness.
All right. Great. Next question here is from Richard Buchanan. When speaking about the time of attack, you took the position that Longstreet was to attack in the morning. Is this not a disputed issue between many authors?
Good question. You know, I think it is and it isn't. It depends on how you look at it. When Britt Eisenberg and I did our Peach Orchard book, and one of the throughputs we put into that book was how the success of the second day Peach Orchard Emmitsburg Road led into Lee's decision to attack on July 3rd. When we put that into the book, we got a favorable review from a noted academic historian, though, who also challenged us and said we were wrong on that. And no, we don't think we are wrong on the timing of it. What I think you've got to look at is in terms of what's disputed by historians. What I think is disputed by historians, I mean, Lee clearly says in his report, I wanted him to attack early the next morning. Ewell says in his report, I was originally told Longstreet was going to attack early in the morning. And Longstreet says in his report, yeah, I was going to attack. I was going to go around the flanks. Would have taken a little bit of time, but I think it wouldn't have been difficult. So all of these guys say they're going to attack in the morning. So I don't think the timing really should be questioned or disputed. What I think is, though, what was that morning attack going to be? And there are people who think the morning attack would have been the assault on the center that we know today is Pickett's charge, where we think the morning attack would have been a renewed assault against the Union left, followed by, what became Pickett's charge. Again, I use the term Plan B. Lee never used that phrase, but I use it. The assault in the afternoon that became known as Pickett's charge, I don't think is what Lee was envisioning in the morning, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this question is from Michael Russo. Discuss the health of General Lee. Was he suffering the effects of heart disease at the time of the battle?
Yeah, I think, and again, thanks for the question, Mike. I used to know a guy named Mike Russo. I don't know if this is the same guy or not. Yeah, good question. We certainly there are accounts indicating that Lee's health is a factor at the Battle of Gettysburg. What's interesting is you don't see, though, a lot of concerns about his health at any other point in the Gettysburg campaign. Obviously, the march into Pennsylvania goes relatively smoothly, other than Lee getting the trots from, probably eating some cherries or whatever. You don't see you don't see a whole lot of concern about that. And then on the retreat, again, which is a very stressful situation, Lee seems to perform well and perform adequately. At the same time, we know after the battle and when they get back into Virginia, we know Lee offers his resignation, and part of what Lee refers to is, okay, maybe somebody younger could do this. So, you do have some suggestion that Lee is probably not in peak health. One of the foreign military observers with the Army of Northern Virginia, not Fremantle, I think it's the Prussian guy, says that Lee was very agitated and kind of off his even keel at Gettysburg, in part because he was stressed and agitated, wondering what had happened to Stuart. So you have that possibly playing into Lee's physical and mental well-being above and beyond the heart issues.
Great. Well, of course, all those York County folks out there know where Stuart was.
Yeah, hopefully.
Right before that battle. Okay, so the next question is again from Richard. I've read a few accounts that stated that, excuse me, the CSA had enough ammo left after the attack to fight one short battle. Does this not contradict Lee's comments about running out of ammo?
Oh, good question. Yeah, it's a very, very good question. It might. it might contradict some of it. Remember too that, and I didn't touch on this as much in the presentation, in addition to quote unquote being out of ammo, one of the factors that happens during the assault is because Union artillery is starting to fall in. We always talk about Confederate overshots. Well, the Yankees overshoot as well. And what seems to happen is because of that, the ordnance trains, the Longstreet's ordnance trains and other Confederate ordnance trains have to be pushed further to the rear. And so, yeah, it might not necessarily be simply we're out of ammunition in terms of we don't have quantity, but the ordnance trains are pushed so far to the rear that they're not available to support them timely during the assault. So yeah, it's definitely a provocative question.
If I could throw in, I mean, that goes back to the age-old complaint that Lee didn't have the tightest grasp on logistics that he might have.
Yeah, maybe.
Uh,
If I could, yeah, along these lines, remember I read you that passage where Lee basically said in his report, which was unknown to me at the time. And Wayne and I were at a round table together one time giving the presentation, and I read that. And a guy stood up in the audience like outraged. Like, you mean to tell me Robert E. Lee didn't know what was going on? It was like that scene in Airplane where the guy gets up and says to the pilot, "You're not telling us the truth." It was one of those moments. So every time we talk about this, I flash back to that guy standing up and pointing his finger at us and saying, "Do you mean to tell me?" And look, I don't mean to tell you anything. I'm just telling you what Lee told us in his report.
Yes, exactly. He said it. Yeah, he said it himself. All right. Okay, the final question we have in the Q&A is from William. Did federal troops leave the line on Cemetery Ridge to counterattack on the flanks during the charge?
Yeah, they did indeed. They did. I touched on it briefly in the presentation, but yeah, certainly with a little more detail. On the Confederate left, starting up on the north side of the field, Confederate left. I love, and probably most of us know the story of the 8th Ohio, Sawyer. Up along the Emmitsburg Road, and basically then coming out, and then pivoting to basically fire into Pettigrew's left flank. But on the other end, you remember Stannard's Vermonters basically do a very similar thing. They come out of the Union lines up towards around the Kadori farm, and then again they pivot, which would be to their right, to basically then fire into what would be Kemper's right flank. After that, though, they then have to pivot and swing around again and fire into Wilcox's left flank. And it really is, the Stannard action is really the most difficult maneuver that the Union Army executes during Pickett's charge. And, for most intents and purposes, they execute it flawlessly. So yeah, absolutely. Definitely don't want to forget about those guys.
Okay. Well, that is all we have in the Q&A. If anyone has any further questions, just this is your opportunity.
Yeah. That was good. A lot of good questions. We had almost as many questions as attendees. I mean, that's great. So everybody came prepared. So.
Yeah, Richard says thanks for a great presentation.
Well, I want to thank you all for attending. As Adam kind of alluded to at the outset, people like us can't do this if people like you don't show up. So, I've had a great time talking to you, hopefully giving you some stuff to chew on. And thank you very much for coming out tonight, as well as those who were watching on Facebook too. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I think at this point, then we'll say goodbye for the night. Echoing what Jim said, absolutely. We appreciate it. And on behalf of the History Center and the York Civil War Roundtable, please come back on March 15th, and we'll hear about women at Gettysburg. So thanks so much. We appreciate your presentation tonight.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Good night.